right, so we're going to start. Okay, I've been told I have to put the mic very close to my mouth, otherwise it won't work. So good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here and welcome. My name is Paqui Paredes. I'm the Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Western. And this is the CHSS, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences Dean's Lecture Series. So I guess it's, my series. This series started quite a few years ago, and our intent is to really try and build and strengthen the connections that we have with the community, not just the campus community, but also the Bellingham community, and as a way to share the research and the scholarly and research activities that go on campus. So with this quarterly talk, and I don't know if any of you guys are regulars or this might be the first time that you attend, but we do it once a quarter, and our intent is to share the knowledge that is produced on campus and create an awareness of how the study of the humanities and the social sciences helps us understand our world, our place in it, and helps us figure out problems and solutions to the problems that our world faces today. And I think the talk that we have today perfectly sort of captures that idea. So first, I would like to introduce you to Professor Josh Kaplan. Josh is an assistant professor in the program, in the behavioral neuroscience program in the Department of Psychology at Western, and this is his first year at Western. And he was kind enough to volunteer to give one of these talks because he truly enjoys sharing his research with a general audience and not just with an audience made up of fellow scholars. So I think you're in for a treat. The title of the talk that Josh is going to give today is Cracking the Cannabis Code, How Advances in Cannabis Research Can Improve Medicine and Limit Harm. Dr. Kaplan, Josh, holds a PhD in behavioral neuroscience from Oregon Health and Science University, and he was a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Pharmacology at the University of Washington before he joined us here at Western the past fall. You may wonder how Dr. Kaplan became interested in the study of cannabis in his current research. He never actually intended to research cannabis, but his quest to reveal novel therapeutic strategies for difficult to treat conditions led him to start looking into cannabis benefits. In the process, Josh has been an active communicator of cannabis science to wide-ranging audiences, including physicians, and I hear movie stars as well. So I hope somebody asks a question about that at the end. His work has been published on popular sites, including Leafly and High Times, from which he was named in the top 100 most influential people in cannabis in 2018. So very well known in his field. Before we start, and we do have to be timely, just a couple of things about logistics. As I said, we are being filmed, and this will be you'll be able to see it, or if you want to share it with friends and family, in Bellingham Channel 10. Because we are being filmed, we are working with a very specific time frame. So our starting time is at 7 and our end time is at 8. We want to leave time for questions, but please reserve your questions for the end. So once Josh is done with his talk, we'll make sure that we leave time for questions. We'll have the microphone. You just need to raise your hand, and Mark, who's my associate dean, will bring the microphone to you. We will have to finish the official part of the program at 8 sharp, but you're welcome to stay and ask questions after that. Before I pass on the stage to Josh, I also want to thank the City of Bellingham. This program is co-sponsored by the city, and they are kind enough to lend us the facilities and help us with all the logistics. And I also want to thank, she's not right here, she's right outside, Melissa Gaines, who welcomed you when you arrived, and she's done all the work that makes this happen and make sure that when we arrive, things are working as they should. So it's a group effort. And with that, Josh, all right. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for taking the time out of your evening to be here today. First, I'd just like to apologize for my voice. I have a toddler at home, and the joys of having a toddler is that you get to live in a petri dish full of germs for a couple of years. So I apologize that my voice is going, but I certainly do appreciate you coming over here tonight and allowing me the chance to share my passion, my research passion, with all of you as well as the city of Bellingham. So Taki said, my name is Josh Kaplan. I'm an assistant professor of behavioral neuroscience, and my research interests are in understanding the therapeutic benefits of cannabis along with its developmental consequences on the brain. And my lab's approach to understanding this is by taking a systematic approach to understanding how the many different chemicals that are produced by the plant interact with one another in the brain. Now, when I speak to physicians and scientists and the general public, it feels like one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that cannabis is cannabis is cannabis, and that it's all equal with regards to its risks as well as its benefits. But I think that that fails to take into account the immense complexity of this plant. And I hope that by better understanding how the different elements work together, we can really develop better therapeutics. Now, this talk is geared to just the scientists, but to anyone who's interested in potentially integrating cannabis into their wellness routine. And I believe that by better understanding this cannabis code, that is how the many interactions between the different chemicals interact in the brain in a region-specific and a dose-specific manner, will lead to the development of better medicines that are both more effective as well as safer. Now, it's pretty obvious that cannabis legalization is sweeping this country and progressing around the world. But even in states that have legal recreational cannabis laws, the laws and regulations that surround cannabis use vary drastically from state to state, which actually makes it pretty much impossible to generalize the effects of cannabis from one state to another. And it really does make it nearly impossible to predict the effects that are going to result from the legalization in a new state. And so I believe that we can gain really important scientific insight into the effects of cannabis on the brain using well-controlled preclinical models in the laboratory. That is, as long as we can mimic the human use patterns. And that's actually been shockingly lacking in the overall cannabis field until recently. And I'll be sharing with you some of my lab strategies to overcome those barriers. But before we begin, the first thing I always do when I give a cannabis lecture is we have to define what it is we're talking about when we're talking about cannabis. So this is a plant that has immense variety, and it produces hundreds of different chemicals. And each different genetic strain has a different combination of these chemicals. The way that these chemicals are produced and interact greatly impact the effect that it has on the user. And so there are thousands of different strains, again, each that have its own unique profile of chemical expression. And the thousands of different strains are not just globally, there are thousands, but in fact, there are thousands grown just here in the state of Washington, and many of them grown right here in Bellingham. So cannabis has over 100 different chemicals, which we call cannabinoids, along with the terpenes, which are the aromatic compounds that give cannabis its unique odor and flavor. The majority of this talk, however, is going to be focused on the cannabinoids. And the two most prominent of those cannabinoids are delta-9 THC and cannabidiol, which is just abbreviated often as CBD. So THC is that main high-inducing cannabinoid that is sought after by recreational users looking to get stoned. And that has its effects by acting on the brain's endocannabinoid system. But THC is not without its own medicinal benefits and has been used for hundreds, if not thousands of years for treating things like nausea, pain, migraines, and is also a potent anti-inflammatory. In fact, it's 20 times as strong of an anti-inflammatory as aspirin and twice as strong as hydrocortisone. But beyond THC, CBD is just making waves through the general public, right? Most of you have probably heard of CBD. And that's because it's thought to have a wide-ranging therapeutic spectrum for treating everything from epilepsy to pain to anxiety and so on. And this wide-ranging therapeutic spectrum is thought to result from the many different targets that CBD has on the brain and body. Now, it's the relative distribution of the THC and the CBD that largely affect how that cannabis product is going to affect you as a user. And so this figure here is showing all of the thousands of different strains that are grown here in the state of Washington as plotted by the amount of CBD found in those strains, as well as the amount of THC. And a couple of things you'll notice right away. One, there are a whole lot of different strains that are grown here in Washington, and there's a ton of variability between them. But there still generally falls into three categories. You have the THC-rich strains, shown here in purple, that have a whole bunch of THC and very little CBD. These are going to be your more recreationally relevant strains for those who are looking to get high, but they're not going to have much in the way of any sort of therapeutic benefit. You also have these CBD-rich strains that have a whole bunch of CBD and very little THC. These are going to be more therapeutically relevant, but don't have much medicinal benefit. They're not going to get you high. But since the legalization of cannabis, there's been an emergence of these more balanced strains, shown here in the teal color, which have more of a 1-to-1 ratio between THC and CBD. And there's emerging evidence that this balance of THC and CBD can have improved therapeutic benefits for certain conditions. So if you go to a rec shop, you'll see a number of different products, right? And on the label of those products, you'll see the amount of THC as well as CBD. And this gives you a hint into the effect that it's going to have on your body. So this strain here, the White Nightmare, which was rich in THC and had practically no CBD, would fall in this category of a recreational strain that would be pretty much ineffective, if not harmful, if being used for therapeutic purposes. So while we can gain a lot of insight into the predicted effect that this cannabis product is going to have on you by just looking at the relative ratio of THC and CBD, you may be thinking, well, how is THC getting me high in the first place? Well, it's having this action by acting on what's known as the endocannabinoid system. Now, the story of this endocannabinoid system is actually somewhat recent as far as like the historical neuroscience literature goes. The story begins back in the 1960s when the Israeli scientist Raphael Mechoulam isolated THC, thinking that this was the primary high-inducing cannabinoid produced by the plant. But it wasn't for 3 decades later that scientists identified the receptor by which THC had these effects. Because THC is a cannabinoid, the scientists called it the cannabinoid receptor. Specifically, the first one they identified, CB1. Since then, there's been a second cannabinoid receptor discovered, the CB2 receptor, and this is thought to mediate most of the cannabinoid's anti-inflammatory effects. Now, in addition to the cannabinoid receptors, our brain and body actually produces its own endocannabinoids, endo being short for endogenous cannabinoids. These two cannabinoids are known as anandamide, which is Sanskrit for bliss, because it's thought to make you feel good when it's being signaled in the brain, as well as 2-AG. So if we have our own endocannabinoids, and THC is acting on these cannabinoid receptors, why aren't we just stoned all the time? And that's a good question. But it comes down to the fact that THC is acting slightly differently than the endocannabinoids on the brain. So this is just a cartoon of the brain cells in your brain that communicate with one another by releasing these chemicals known as neurotransmitters that cross a small space and activate receptors on the downstream brain cell. Now, THC acts by activating CB1 receptors, which are shown here by these blue squiggly lines. This is how neuroscientists sometimes describe or show receptors. But they activate these CB1 receptors and shut down neurotransmitter release. Now, this is the same effect that happens with the endocannabinoids. So how is THC different? Well, it's a weak activator of CB1 receptors. It acts all over the brain, not just where it's needed, as the endocannabinoids do. And it also sticks around for a long time. So the fact that it's sticking around for a long time, it's acting indiscriminately, leads to that subjective high that users experience. Now, I point that out to now differentiate the effects of CBD, which, as I mentioned before, has many different targets in the brain and body. And at this point, over 65 have been discovered, and more seem to continue to be discovered on a weekly basis. And each one of these mechanisms seems to contribute to differential effects and potentially lead to therapeutic benefits across a range of conditions. For instance, CBD activates we call serotonin receptors. Some of you may have heard of serotonin because SSRIs like Prozac lead to the increased activation of these serotonin receptors as well. And this is thought to lead to CBD's anxiolytic and antidepressant effects. CBD also blocks a protein known as GPR55, terribly boring name, but this is thought to underlie its anti-epileptic effects that have gained a lot of popularity. In addition, CBD blocks an enzyme that breaks down anandamide. Now, why am I bringing this up? Well, some of you may have actually read a headline that was in the news just a couple weeks ago where this woman from Scotland was discovered to not experience any anxiety or any pain. Well, that's interesting, right? That's a novel finding. So scientists went and rightfully genotyped her to be like, what is going on? Maybe we can learn something from this. It turns out that she has a genetic mutation that pretty much renders this enzyme ineffective. So basically, her genetic mutation is having the same effect as CBD. And so it provides some extra foundational support for why CBD might be a promising anxiolytic and and pain-relieving medication. Now, beyond those common mechanisms, another one that's really important when considering CBD's effects, either on its own or in conjunction with other cannabinoids, is the fact that it blocks THC's effects on those CB1 receptors. So if THC is getting you stoned by activating CB1 receptors, which also lead to some of the negative consequences associated with THC intoxication, like paranoia, acute psychosis, CBD can protect against the onset of those effects. So that's important to note now that the integration of multiple cannabinoids, like THC and CBD, can not only influence the degree of the intoxication, how high you might get, but it also influences the strength of those negative side effects. So I think that cannabis represents a really rare and interesting case in medicinal pharmacology. Normally, scientists, basically you have a clinical condition or a disease, you figure out the mechanism of that disease, and you design a drug in order to treat that disease. So you design a drug, you test it in preclinical models, and then you translate it to humans. But cannabis has actually gone in the opposite direction, in which there have been many anecdotal reports of cannabis's therapeutic benefits for a number of different conditions that have led scientists to say, maybe there's something there, and we should study that in the lab. But yet, there are many people out there who believe that there just isn't enough in the way of preclinical or clinical support to suggest that cannabis would be a beneficial treatment option. But I think that fails to take into account that indeed there have been a lot of clinical trials looking at cannabis-based therapies across a number of conditions. And by 2017, there have been over 18,000 patients that have engaged in successful cannabis-based clinical trials, from everything ranging from epilepsy to treating sleep disorders, spasticity and multiple sclerosis and ALS, as well as pain. And so while these clinical trials still have a ways to go with regards to optimizing cannabinoid formulations as well as identifying optimal dosing, to say that there just isn't any clinical evidence, I believe is false. Again, we have a ways to go, but there is evidence that continues to come out in support of cannabis-based therapies if used under the right conditions, with the right combinations of different chemicals, and at the right doses. And this is something that our lab hopes to really further our understanding in the field so that we can optimize the cannabinoid combinations as well as the optimal dosing for treating a variety of different conditions. So if we're thinking about what's the best way to achieve safe and effective use of cannabis for treating different conditions, we really have to consider two things. First of all, what's in the product? That's number one. And what's the optimal dose? So let's start by considering the importance of the cannabinoid composition. So I think one of the overall benefits of cannabis as a potential treatment option, especially in the cases of otherwise treatment-resistant disorders, is that it has a relatively high therapeutic index. Now, this therapeutic index is merely the difference between the therapeutic dose, which is the one that is used to treat a certain condition, compared to the toxic dose, the one that's going to lead to an adverse or negative side effect. So a larger therapeutic index is associated with a greater safety profile. Now, THC, that high-inducing cannabinoid, is thought to have a pretty low therapeutic index during the stages when the brain is still developing. But CBD, on the other hand, is thought to have a much higher therapeutic index at all stages of brain development. But that's at least the common perception. I'll be honest, I'm not convinced that we have enough data to suggest that CBD is safe on the developing brain. And my lab is actively seeking to fill in this line. But until we get more data, I'm still a little bit skeptical on this. But at least in adults, the therapeutic index for both of these cannabinoids is relatively high, especially in relation to some of the other medications that are currently being prescribed to people. So when we're thinking about ways of influencing the therapeutic index, which again is associated with safe use, things that we want to consider is the cannabinoid composition, how much THC is there, how much CBD is there, what are the use patterns, so how frequently are people using, as well as the route of administration. And we're going to touch on that towards the end of the talk, but the route of administration can make a big difference in the overall effects that the cannabis has on your brain and body. And so thinking about the long-term safety risk of using cannabis, it's actually been really hard to get a long-term assessment of the effects that these drugs are having on the brain and body, because within just the last 20 years, the amount of THC in your average strain of cannabis has nearly tripled, from about 5% in the mid-90s to over 18% in the United States. A paper just came out just about a month ago showing that the THC potency in the average strain that's been tested in the United States is over 18%. This is not your father's or your grandfather's cannabis anymore. We are in a whole new level when it comes to THC potency. And so it makes it really hard to generalize the effects that cannabis was having in people 20, 30, 40 years ago to what people are using today. And it's also important to note that as these THC levels are rising, the CBD levels are falling. And as I've already mentioned to you, CBD can protect against a lot of those negative effects that could come from THC intoxication. So you can get higher than ever now, but it can come at greater risk. And this study exemplifies some of the protective effects that CBD can have on the negative side effects caused by THC. So in this study, participants were injected IV with THC. I recognize that there are limitations in that study because I don't know anyone who is IV injecting THC, but this was a controlled study and this was their approach. Nonetheless, THC injection normally induced psychotic symptoms in these participants, as one might expect. However, when they were pre-treated with CBD, the degree of their psychotic symptoms were substantially lower. Again, suggesting that CBD can be used as a protective mechanism against some of the negative side effects associated with THC. And these effects are similar when it comes to THC's induction of anxiety. CBD can protect against that, as well as acute paranoia. So the cannabinoid composition can be optimized not only to affect the degree of your high, but also to impact the severity of those side effects. All right, so the cannabinoid composition matters not only for the strength of the high, but for the side effect risk as well. But what about dosing? Why is dosing so important? And I actually think that this is one of the most underappreciated pieces when it comes to proper medicinal cannabis use, is recognizing the importance of dose. Now, I like to think of this as the fact that cannabis, and particularly CBD, has an optimal dosing range by which if you have too little, you get no effect, and if you have too much, you actually lose the effect. I think this is a hard concept for a lot of people to grasp, because if you think about just the medications that most people are on, for instance, if you're in pain, you take more pain medication. That helps, right? The more, the better. Whether it's Advil or morphine, the more you take, the less pain you feel. But when it comes to CBD, for instance, sometimes more is not always better, and you actually lose the benefits that are achieved at lower doses. So I call this the Goldilocks zone of CBD dosing, in which you don't want too little and you don't want too much. And this is seen for a number of different conditions in which CBD and THC have been shown to be effective. For instance, when it comes to treating anxiety or depression, it seems that a low or moderate dose of CBD is the most effective. Too little of a dose, you don't get any effect. Too high of a dose, you lose that effect. But that dose is often 10 times lower or even more than the effective dose used to treat things like epilepsy, in which you need a massive dose in order to see the therapeutic benefits. And so this, what we call an inverted U dose response curve, because it looks like a U turned upside down, is present across a variety of different conditions. And so, you know, a lot of people want to know, well, what dose should I use? And we just, unfortunately, due to federal regulations, don't have that data available to users. So I think the best strategy whenever considering integrating CBD into maybe your wellness lifestyle is to start low and go slow and figure out the optimal dose that works for you. But the reason this dose response curve exists is, again, it comes back to this idea that CBD targets many different things within the brain and body. Again, over 65 of these targets have been identified. And as you increase the dose, more and more of these targets become activated. And some of them that are hit at higher doses actually counteract the effects that CBD has at lower doses. So for instance, when treating things like anxiety, which might require a moderate dose, you're hitting certain targets in the brain and body that when you go to higher doses are overridden by these additional targets. And so identifying this optimal dosing window is not easy, and it can be frustrating and expensive. But at this point, we just don't have really good guidelines for telling people what the optimal dose should be. And it does come down to a degree of self-experimentation, unfortunately. So again, the dosing is critical. So beyond dosing, the composition of the chemicals, beyond just CBD and THC, are thought to contribute to the overall effects that the cannabis product will have. And this includes both the cannabinoids as well as those aromatic terpenes. So as I mentioned before, in addition to the cannabinoids, cannabis produces a whole set of aromatic compounds that many of you probably know of from a variety of different sources. If you're just walking down the street and you're like, ooh, I smell weed, it's not the THC or CBD that you smell, it's the terpenes. The cannabinoids themselves have no odor, but it's these other elements, the terpenes, that make it a unique product. A number of these terpenes, too, have been identified to have therapeutic benefits on their own. And some of these are well known from their sources. For instance, many cannabis products and cannabis strains are rich in what's known as linalool. Now, linalool isn't just grown by cannabis or produced by cannabis, but is a prominent terpene in lavender. And linalool itself is thought to have pain-relieving effects. It might be sedating as well as have anxiolytic qualities. Beta-caryophyllene, which is what gives black pepper its spiciness, well, this has anti-inflammatory and pain-relieving effects by acting on the same endocannabinoid receptors as THC, those CB2 receptors. Limonene, which is both stimulating and energizing, comes from the citrus peels of citrus fruits. Myrcene, which comes from hops and lemongrass, is sedating, can be analgesic and anxiolytic. So based on the potential therapeutic benefits of these terpenes, which have been identified in isolation, one might hypothesize that the combination of these terpenes, along with the cannabinoids, may indeed lead to enhanced therapeutic benefits. So I like to think of this using a car analogy, that if I'm trying to get from point A to point B, obviously the motor is important. That engine, the torque, the horsepower is an important element of getting me to my destination. Well, that engine is driven by the main cannabinoids like THC and CBD. They're going to determine my horsepower. But there's other elements of the ride, the quietness, the smoothness, how nice it feels sitting behind the wheel. That seems to be driven by the relative expression of these terpenes. And so different strains not only express different cannabinoid levels, but they also express different amounts of these terpenes. And the combination of the terpenes and cannabinoids greatly impact the overall effect that it has on the brain and body, and potentially could be optimized to treat a number of conditions. And this comes back to this idea, which in the literature is known as the entourage effect, which basically suggests that the combination of multiple cannabinoids, as well as along with their terpenes, has better overall therapeutic benefits than the cannabinoids in isolation. So kind of thinking about it as the team is greater than the individual. And this entourage effect has been demonstrated for a number of conditions. Here I'm just showing you one condition. We're looking at the degree of inflammation following exposure to CBD in isolation or a whole plant extract containing CBD along with a variety of other cannabinoids and terpenes. I hope you can appreciate that when CBD is used in isolation, there's a very narrow dose window in which it's effective. And if you overshoot that dose window, you lose its efficacy. However, when taken from a whole plant extract, that dose window expands, and you can actually get enhanced therapeutic benefits, and in this case, better reductions in inflammation. So this idea that many cannabinoids and terpenes working together can lead to better therapeutic potential, it suggests that maybe we can optimize our formulas for specific conditions by increasing the amount of certain cannabinoids as well as certain terpenes. And that's an area that my lab is actively interested in pursuing. So other conditions that could influence the impact that cannabis has on the user, first of all, there are many. We only have time to discuss two of them. But one of them is the method of consumption, and the other is biological sex. So let's first start with method of consumption. So the two most common forms of consumption are the inhalation method, so smoking or vaping, and the second most common form of consumption, at least across the United States, are edibles. And so I'm lumping both food edibles, beverages that are infused and contain cannabinoids, as well as pills, because it goes through the same kind of route from ingestion to the bloodstream. So when we're comparing these two, yes, you're being exposed to the same chemicals. However, they can greatly impact the effect that it has on the brain. So when you smoke or vape, you're basically getting the cannabinoids to get from your lungs directly into the bloodstream without ever having to pass through your digestion. That's going to get that THC into your bloodstream, which quickly makes its way up to the brain, and as I mentioned before, activates those CB1 receptors. That's what gets you stoned. But when you eat an edible or consume a pill or drink a beverage, those cannabinoids only get into your bloodstream after they've passed through your digestive system, meaning that that your digestive system has an opportunity to start metabolizing those cannabinoids and breaking them down. The reason that's important is because THC, once it gets into your stomach and gets broken down by enzymes in the liver, gets converted into a metabolite with just a terribly boring name known as 11-hydroxy-THC. But this is important because 11-hydroxy-THC is actually a stronger activator of CB1 receptors than THC is. So when you consume an edible, you're getting more of this stronger CB1 agonist or activator than you would get if you were smoking or vaping. So when you eat an edible, some people may report that they are much higher, they get more stoned than when they smoked or vaped. And that's the main reason why. So if we think about the strength of those cannabinoids on CB1 receptor activation, THC is a weak activator, but 11-hydroxy-THC is much stronger. So it's going to get you more stoned. But this doesn't even pale in comparison to some of those synthetic cannabinoids that are legally available, like Spice and K2 and the many others that are out there. All it takes, and this is kind of a reflection of the way that we legalize or make certain drugs illegal in this country, is basically things are legal until they're proven to be harmful. So all it takes is a chemist to change the chemical structure just a bit of a known illegal substance to then make it legal. And then they can be sold at grocery stores or smoke shops. But these synthetic cannabinoids can be over 100 times more potent, meaning they're acting over 100 times more strongly at those CB1 receptors than THC is. So they're having a vastly different effect, a much more powerful effect on the brain and body, and can lead to things like overdose, heart palpitations. They've even led to a number of deaths due to its effects on the cardiovascular system. So when we're talking about the synthetic cannabinoids, which sometimes in the academic literature get grouped in with THC, and this is just not fair. These are not the same substances. So it's important to note that if thinking about using cannabinoid products, you really want to be avoiding this stuff. This is nasty. Now, in addition to the route of administration that can influence the degree of the high, it's important to note that biological sex can also influence the strength of that high. So it turns out that biological women are more susceptible to the negative effects of THC because it's thought that THC acts more strongly at their CB1 receptors than for men. And a lot of this stems from the effects of estrogen. So THC's effects are shown to be stronger when estrogen levels are high. And in addition, estrogen, at least during stages of development, when the brain is becoming sexually dimorphic, it is enabling the future use of THC to cause much stronger effects in women than in men. And this is important in the context of social use, in which cannabis is a social drug. Men and women are often using it together, but people have to recognize that it might be affecting the different sexes in a different manner. Now, this may be a positive thing. If you're using it to treat pain, well, women report that cannabis is a more effective pain reliever than men tend to. But this also puts them at greater risk for developing cannabis use disorders, and women indeed seem to develop cannabis use disorders quicker and more frequently. So it's just something important to note when thinking about, okay, well, if I have a male friend who's using this, well, it's going to affect me the same way. If I'm a female, that's not necessarily the case. It's something that people should be aware of. So I've shared with you a number of different important elements when thinking about potentially using or integrating cannabis into your kind of medicinal needs or your wellness routine. Talked about the relative ratio of THC to CBD being an important mediator, the role that dosing can have on the overall efficacy of use. But now I just want to share with you some of my lab's directions on where we're going to be going to further cannabis science. So much of the academic literature that is sought to understand how cannabis acts in the brain unfortunately uses methods that do not mimic human consumption patterns. The most common way that people use cannabis is by smoking it or eating it. But the most common way that scientists study cannabis is by injecting it. And as I've already mentioned, by comparing the effects of smoking versus just eating, that can have a vastly different impact on how it's affecting brain function. So we need to be mimicking human use patterns. And so we're going to try and use exposure techniques, and we've already begun doing so, that mimic these human use patterns. So one of the ways that we can do it is we can create basically a cannabis jello where we add the cannabinoids into a food substance that the animals eat and get it in through that method. This mimics the oral consumption pattern of people eating brownies or cookies or whatever. But we also have passive inhalation chambers, which are basically hot boxes for mice. So I'll show you a little video of what that looks like. Basically, you put the mice in these chambers, and you can systematically control what these animals are exposed to. And this allows them to be exposed to the different cannabinoids that we can add in a systematic manner, allows them to inhale it, which is going to have a vastly different effect, again, on the way the brain functions compared to the edible method or even an injection method. So we're using these hot boxes to get at some of the effects on cannabis exposure through the inhalation method. And I'm not just doing this because I think it's, good science, but it also drastically impacts the effects that the cannabinoids will have on brain function. There was a study published just a few months ago that basically looked at the differential effects of injecting mice compared to exposing mice to cannabis smoke on a working memory task. So, and excuse me, this was done in rats, not in mice. But basically, they looked at the effects of injecting rats with THC and found that that impaired working memory. This was kind of the standard finding in the literature that when you inject animals with THC, their memory performance deteriorates. But when they exposed those animals to smoke from THC cigarettes, they actually found that the animals that were kind of on the lower end of the performance spectrum, just at baseline, actually performed better after exposure to the smoke. So this suggests that the route of administration absolutely matters, not in just how it's activating CB1 receptors, but how it's impacting behavior as well. So again, we believe that this inhalation method is a much more valid method to study cannabinoid exposure than the injection method. Next, we're really interested in studying the effects of cannabis from what we call a whole plant pharmacological approach. So not just looking at the effects of a single cannabinoid in isolation, which is really the standard method of studying cannabis in academic laboratories. Let's just look at THC, or let's just look at CBD. But most of the products that people are using, most of the products that are available in rec shops, they don't just have THC or CBD in them. They have other minor cannabinoids. There may be a relative ratio of THC to CBD. There are going to be terpenes. So we're trying to get at the effects of cannabis from a whole plant standpoint. And there are some government regulations surrounding this, but we are teaming up and collaborating with other people around the country that are helping us bypass some of these government regulations so that we can understand the effects that cannabis has by using products that are available to the general population, as opposed to just these cannabinoids in isolation that no one is actually using. And as I mentioned before, the cannabinoids are interacting with one another at the level of the individual brain cell. And so when we're trying to understand the overall effects that these products are having, we need to look at them with all of those interactions in place. And then lastly, we're interested in systematically studying how these different cannabinoids and terpenes are interacting with each other on brain cell communication. And so this video basically is an audio recording of the activity of individual brain cells. So the language of brain cells is mainly electrical. And so we can record electrical currents and see how that is changed when we expose those brain cells to different cannabinoids. And we can optimize this approach for specific conditions that would require specific changes in brain cell communication. So each one of these, the staticky noises, is a brain cell communicating with another brain cell. So that's just the noise of your brain working and the cells communicating with one another. And we can record changes in that communication pattern in response to exposure to a single cannabinoid, so a little bit of THC, but what about how does it change with a little bit of THC and some CBD? How does it change with some THC, CBD, and linalool? And so we can take a systematic approach to understanding how all of these elements are playing together to predict and develop better and more effective therapies. And so basically, we've gotten at a couple main points so far. I've told you that THC is the main high-inducing cannabinoid and has some therapeutic purposes or properties. CBD blunts some of THC's effects, and yes, that was intended. It also has a range of therapeutic effects. I've told you that dosing is a critical consideration, and I cannot emphasize that enough for effective use. And that cannabinoid composition, biological sex, and the route of administration all influence the effect that cannabis has on the body. And they should be optimized based on your reason for use. So where do I see the future of medicinal cannabis going? Well, this gets back to this idea of the cannabis code. And I believe that we can develop optimized products, optimized cannabis-based medicines, by better understanding the interactions between the many cannabinoids and terpenes. And so once we have identified the optimal combination, the next part of the puzzle is creating products that have those optimized formulas in them. But doing so is, one, very challenging because creating consistent strains is really hard based on light levels, soil composition, water, all of these things that might throw off the composition just enough that you lose those optimal benefits. This is also really challenging and costly. Now, I'm not saying this is definitely the future, but it could be an interesting approach. So there are groups out there that are working to create cannabinoids by manipulating yeast. And so you basically can take baker's yeast, you switch up a couple enzymes in there, you throw on sugar, and 3 to 7 days later, you can get THC or CBD or any of the other cannabinoids and terpenes that you want. And you can do this at a fraction of the price that it would cost to grow this on a farm. So one of the groups that's out there that's received millions of dollars in federal funding to optimize this approach claims that they can create a kilogram of CBD for only $20, which is substantially cheaper than other products that are currently on the market, like these hemp-based extracts, where you can get about 2.5 grams of CBD for over $1,000. And children who are using CBD for the treatment of pediatric epilepsy are taking almost 1,000 milligrams a day. So we need a cheaper approach, one that might be more cost effective, one where you can get better control, and one that is more environmentally friendly than growing cannabis in the current manner. Now again, I'm not saying that this is the future, but perhaps one day in the future, you'll find that your next high is not coming from the plant, but is coming from yeast. So with that, first of all, thank you for your attention. I'd like to also thank my lab members who are just constantly motivating this process and are really engaged in what I believe to be exciting and important work. Mac Brooks, Keely Reed, Hannah Webster. This is Hannah Webster here showing Senator Patty Murray our passive inhalation chambers. Finn McGinnis, Gavin Fees, Becca Arvilla, and Jasmine Wagner, who are all super motivated students working in the lab who are really going to, I believe, change and turn this cannabis research field on its head. So with that, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.
So how many other places around the country are doing these types of studies?
So as of only a couple years ago, and I don't have an exact number, in order to do these studies with THC and CBD, you have to have what's known as a Schedule I research license from the DEA. Now, as of just a few years ago, there were only a couple hundred of those licenses in the country, and they may not have been studying cannabis. They could have been studying heroin or other Schedule I drugs. So how many are doing this? At this point, we don't have a great number. With the legalization, more are coming on board and starting to get into the game. But I think we have a really unique approach of using this electrophysiological approach of understanding brain cell communication patterns, as well as using these passive inhalation chambers to get at these novel routes of administration. So I think we're one of the few that are taking that approach to studying cannabis.
How are you measuring the anti-inflammatory effect of CBD, like by symptom reporting or by like C-reactive protein and anti-inflammatory measurements, or how are you measuring it?
Yeah, so my lab is not measuring it directly yet. We are not involved in the anti-inflammatory field, but the researchers out there that are doing so are measuring. So for instance, one of the things that they do, and in the study that I showed you on inflammation and CBD, what they did was they injected a pro-inflammatory protein into the paws of the animals, which caused an inflammatory response. And they can measure the size of that inflammatory response and how that was influenced by CBD. You can also measure circulating what we call cytokines that are involved in the inflammatory response, so you can get multiple measures of inflammation as well. And you can pair that with pain measurements too, to see how sensitive they are to pain. More inflammation tends to be associated with greater pain sensitivity. So generally, studies that look at inflammation are also looking at pain as well.
So it seems like therapeutic cannabis use is trending towards more of like a complex balance between the constituents of the plant, whereas recreational use it seems to be going towards high THC and low CBD. So those seem to be going in opposition, trending in opposition of each other. So do you see that as a public health issue? And how would do you have any ideas on how to approach that?
I think that's a really good point and a great observation, and one that tends to be lacking from the literature. Often you see, because we have these federal regulations on studying cannabis at a population level, we're stuck with just basically asking people, did you use cannabis or not, and how is that affecting your condition, your symptoms? But that's lumping together recreational cannabis strains that, as you say, are rich in THC and have no CBD, along with those therapeutically relevant strains that are much higher in CBD. When you're putting those all together, the results get muddled, and then people say, well, it had no effect. We need better control over what people are using and how they're using it. And I think it also comes down to, look, my stance is generally to each their own, do what you want, but I think it's important for the public to understand, if they are thinking of using cannabis for therapeutic purposes, that there are different products out there that might be better for certain conditions. talking to physicians, sometimes they might say, yeah, their patient came in and they said that they're using cannabis to treat anxiety, and then they talk to their patient and finds out they're using a super rich THC strain that's actually gonna be making their anxiety worse. I think it's kind of like just a public education mission as well. The recreational drive to make strains that are richer in THC is somewhat just driven by the financial markets, that even though there's a burgeoning medicinal cannabis market, it's still driven by recreational use. The recreational market is almost 4 times the size of the medicinal market. And so that's still driving the development of new strains and these competitions by who can grow the strains with the most THC. That's a trend that's going to continue. Up until a few years ago, you never saw a strain that was above 28% THC. Now they're approaching 33, 34, 35%, and it just keeps growing.
Do you think that the increase of cannabis for therapeutic effects will at some point overtake the over-prescription of opioids?
I certainly hope so. We obviously have a major problem on our hands with the opioid epidemic. And I personally believe that cannabis is a great tool to combat this epidemic for a number of reasons. One, on its own, cannabis can have pretty powerful pain-relieving qualities. It's not as strong as opioids. Nothing is better at relieving pain than opioids, but that's part of the problem, right? And a number of people say, and they've done studies on this, that even though opioids tend to be a better pain reliever as far as overall efficacy than cannabis, many people will prefer to use cannabis because it has fewer side effects. And I think people fail to take into account that there's more to use than just simply efficacy. There are other reasons why people will use it. So one of the things is that, yes, it could be a pain reliever on its own. The other is that, and this is one of the things that I think people don't appreciate all that much, is that the endocannabinoid system that we talked about functionally and physically interacts with the opioid system. So by activating the CB1 receptors, it strengthens the effect of activating the opioid receptors, such that if you use a small amount of THC and a small amount of an opioid medication like morphine, the combination can lead to really strong pain-relieving effects. And as a result, you also get less risk of the tolerance buildup that leads down the road to addiction and dependence and that sort of thing. So I think one of the futures by which you could start to integrate cannabis-based medicines for treating pain and stuff is maybe not just using it on its own, but trying to develop medications that take advantage of both systems. And there have been several studies that show that a sub-threshold dose of THC, meaning on its own that amount of THC had no effect, when combined with a sub-threshold dose of an opioid, like either Oxycontin or morphine, together led to substantial pain relief where the individual elements had no effect. So both of those components, I think, could lead to a potential move away from solely using opioids as a pain medicine. And I'm hopeful that we continue to go that route.
Thank you, Mark. So this finishes the formal part of our event, but you're welcome to come up and ask Josh any questions. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you,
Thank
Josh.
you.
I feel like